The mortar hit 30 meters to Kai Maddox's left and turned Sergeant Ewan into a column of red mist and shattered ceramic plate. The concussion rolled through the trench line like a fist made of pressure, slamming Maddox sideways into the packed earth wall, and by the time his hearing crawled back through the ringing, he could already hear the second round dropping the whistle of a Kethara bombardment shell cutting atmosphere at 700 meters per second, the sound every human on Kethara V had learned to measure their remaining seconds against. "Down!" he bellowed, and the 17 soldiers in his section pressed themselves flat as the second shell detonated 10 meters behind the trench, showering them with clods of alien soil, the color of burnt copper and fragments of the communication relay they had spent 2 hours digging in. Maddox lifted his head. Through the haze of particulate and smoke, the Kethara line was visible 400 meters to the north, a ridge of white stone crowned with their field positions, their banner poles flying the triple sun sigil of the burning orthodoxy, their gun emplacements cycling with the metronomic precision of a species that had been waging holy wars across 3 spiral arms for 11,000 years. Behind the ridge, rising into the pale amber sky like the spines of a cathedral built for gods who despised mercy, were the towers of Kethar Vas, the Kethari's most sacred fortress temple, the place from which the hierarchs had issued the reclamation decree that had killed 8 million human beings on Caldera Station. 8 million. Maddox had stopped trying to imagine the number as individual people 3 years ago, when the intelligence reports arrived with the forensic reconstruction of what the reclamation had actually looked like. The Kethari had not bombed Caldera Station. They had not gassed it, or irradiated it, or done any of the things that military doctrine filed under acceptable methods of mass destruction. They had walked through it. 200,000 Kethari penitent soldiers, armed with ceremonial blades, had boarded the station through 40 breach points simultaneously and walked through every corridor, every habitation module, every school, every medical ward, every park, every cafeteria where families were eating dinner. They walked through and they cut. Not quickly, not efficiently. The forensic analysis estimated the reclamation had taken 14 hours. 14 hours during which 8 million civilians, including the 4,000 children enrolled in Caldera's education program, were killed by hand, one at a time, because the burning orthodoxy scripture held that a righteous cleansing required the penitent to look into each face and speak the name of the sin being expunged before drawing the blade. The sin, according to the hierarch's decree, was existence. Human existence on a world the Kethari had declared sacred 6,000 years before humans existed. It did not matter that Caldera Station was a deep space habitat, not a planet. It did not matter that it orbited a star the Kethari had never visited, in a system they had never mapped, in a region of space they had never claimed until the decree was issued. The hierarchs declared it sacred retroactively, because sacredness in Kethari theology was not a function of history or use or presence. It was a function of divine will, and divine will could be applied to any coordinate in the universe at any time, for any reason, and once applied, any non-Kethari life at those coordinates was an abomination. Maddox had read the decree. It was 4 pages long. 3 of those pages were liturgical preamble. The 4th contained 9 words in Kethari high formal script that translated to, "All human presence at the sacred coordinate is sin. Reclaim." 9 words, 8 million dead. The 3rd mortar shell hit the trench line 40 meters to the right, and Maddox heard screaming, not the panicked scream of surprise, but the grinding, animal sound of someone who had just discovered what their body looked like from the inside. He keyed his command frequency. "Vasquez status." The reply came in bursts, broken by static and the flat crack of small arms fire. 3rd Platoon took a direct hit on the forward trench, Commander. 6 dead, 9 wounded. We're pulling back to the secondary position. Hold the secondary. Do not pull further back. If we lose the ridge approach, we lose the assault corridor. Copy. Maddox crawled to the forward observation point, a notch in the trench wall reinforced with salvaged Kethara stone, positioned where two drainage channels met. From here, he could see the full breadth of the contested ground. 800 meters of open terrain between the human trench line and the Kethara ridge. A killing field of broken rock and scrub vegetation that the Kethara bombardment had been systematically flattening for 3 days. The ground was littered with debris from previous assaults, abandoned equipment, shattered drones, the carbon-scored remains of 2 Wolverine armored carriers that had tried to rush the ridge on the first day and been destroyed by Kethara magnetic lance batteries before they covered half the distance. Beyond the ridge, the towers of Kethara caught the morning light. They were beautiful. Maddox hated that they were beautiful, but there was no honest way to deny it. The Kethara built their temples from a white stone quarried from Kethara's polar mountains, veined with mineral deposits that refracted light into subtle prismatic effects, blues, golds, greens shifting through the stone as the sun tracked overhead. The towers rose in a cluster of 7, the tallest over 300 meters, their surfaces carved with scripture that the Kethara believed was the literal voice of their god frozen in stone. From a distance, they looked like fingers reaching for the sky, and Maddox had once thought, in an unguarded moment during the first week of the campaign, that they looked like something worth preserving. That was before he had accessed the chamber beneath the central tower, before he had seen the trophy room, before he had understood that the prismatic veins in the white stone were not mineral deposits. The veins were bone, human bone, ground to powder and mixed into the quarry slurry before casting. The stone of Kethara contained the physical remains of every species the Kethara had reclaimed across 11,000 years of holy wars. The hierarchs considered it an honor the sinful dead, purified through incorporation into the sacred structure, their atoms participating in worship for eternity. The forensic team that analyzed the tower stone found genetic markers from 47 different species. 6 of those species no longer existed. Maddox pressed his forehead against the edge of the observation notch and breathed. The air tasted like cordite and alien pollen. Behind him, his soldiers were redistributing ammunition, treating the walking wounded, and watching him with the particular attention that soldiers give a commander they suspect is about to ask them to die. He knew it with the same flat certainty he knew his own name. The assault on Kethara had been stalled for 3 days. Earth's naval forces had achieved orbital superiority 14 hours ago. Admiral Chen's 7th Combined Fleet had broken the Kethara orbital defense grid in a 30-minute engagement that destroyed 212 Kethara warships and cost Earth 19. But orbital superiority did not help with a ground assault against a fortified position, shielded by the kind of energy barriers that the Kethara reserved for their most sacred sites. The barriers absorbed orbital bombardment, redirected kinetic strikes, and turned precision-guided munitions into expensive fireworks. The only way through was on foot, through the killing field, over the ridge, and into the temple complex to destroy the barrier generators from inside. Earth had committed 9 battalions to the ground campaign, 8,700 soldiers, supported by armor, artillery, close air support, and the most advanced battlefield technology humanity had ever fielded. The Kethara had 40,000 penitent warriors behind the barriers, armed with a combination of ancient blade weapons and modern magnetic lance artillery, fighting on sacred ground they believed their god had personally consecrated, and motivated by a theology that classified death in defense of a temple as the highest possible spiritual achievement. In 3 days, Maddox had lost 1,100 soldiers. The Kethara had lost roughly 4,000. The mathematics did not favor a frontal assault, and every tactical analysis his staff had run confirmed what he already knew. A conventional approach would require reinforcements they did not have, and time the orbital fleet could not guarantee. His communications officer, Lieutenant Ashad Davy, slid into the observation point beside him. She was 26 years old, had graduated first in her class at the Signals Academy on Titan, and had spent the last 3 days coordinating fire missions with a calm precision that made her seem older than she was. There was blood on her collar that was not hers. "Commander, Admiral Chen on the command channel." Maddox took the handset. "Chen." "Go." The Admiral's voice was clipped, compressed by the encryption layer into something that sounded almost mechanical. "Maddox, I need a timeline. The Kethara have 3 battle groups inbound from their core systems. My fleet intelligence estimates arrival in 16 to 20 hours. When they arrive, I lose orbital superiority, and your ground force loses air support, medevac, and resupply. I need those barrier generators down before that window closes." "Understood. What's the reinforcement situation?" "There are no reinforcements. 9th Division is pinned on Kethara II. The reserves are committed to the orbital defense perimeter. You have what you have." Maddox looked at the ridge. 400 meters of killing field, 40,000 Kethara behind energy barriers, and no reinforcements. Against that, he had 7,600 soldiers, the survivors of 3 days of attrition, a dwindling ammunition supply, and a window that would close in less than 20 hours. "I need one thing from you," Maddox said. "Name it." "At 600 tomorrow, I need every ship in your fleet that can angle a gun downward to hit the ridge line with everything they have. Sustained bombardment, 15 minutes. The barriers will absorb most of it, but the energy has to go somewhere. My engineers say continuous bombardment at fleet scale will overload the barrier's thermal dissipation system. The barriers won't fail, but they'll thin. For about 90 seconds after the bombardment stops, there will be gap sections where the barrier strength drops below 60%, wide enough for infantry to push through." 90 seconds. That's what the engineers say. There was a pause. Maddox could hear the faint hum of Chen's bridge in the background, the quiet professionalism of a fleet that had just destroyed 200 warships and was now counting the hours until the next engagement. 90 seconds to push 7,000 soldiers through gaps in an energy barrier, while 40,000 Kethara fire on them from prepared positions, Chen said. "Yes." "What's your projected casualty rate?" Maddox had run the numbers. He had run them 6 times, adjusting variables each time, and the answer had not changed. 60 to 70% to reach the barrier. Another 20 to 30% in the close engagement inside the complex. If we get soldiers to the generators, we can destroy them, but the cost to get there will be most of the force. Silence on the channel, then, and if you don't go. Then the barriers stay up, your fleet retreats when the Kethara reinforcements arrive, and the hierarchs declare the reclamation of Caldera Station a divine success. They issue a second decree. They do it again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but they will walk through another station and they will cut, and they will grind the bones into their temple walls, and they will call it worship. 600, Chen said. "You'll have your bombardment." The channel closed. Maddox sat in the observation notch and looked at the sky. It was clearing Kethara V's atmosphere, cycling through its afternoon transparency, the pale amber giving way to something closer to gold as the local star climbed toward its zenith. The towers of Kethara Vos caught the light and scattered it into those subtle prismatic effects, blues and golds shifting through the white stone, through the stone made of bones. He had 14 hours. Maddox spent the first 4 of those hours doing what commanders do when they have decided to spend the lives of their soldiers. He made it count. He walked the trench line from end to end, 2.5 kilometers of packed earth and salvaged stone, and he spoke to every unit commander face to face, not on the radio, face to face. He wanted them to see his eyes when he told them what he was asking. Major Petra San, commanding 1st Battalion, listened to the plan in the forward command bunker with her arms folded and her jaw set. She was 51 years old, had served in 3 campaigns, and had the particular steadiness of an officer who had long ago made peace with the idea that her job might require dying. She asked one question: "Where will you be during the assault?" "First wave, center corridor." She nodded. It was the only answer she would have accepted. Captain Rio Tannis, commanding the remnants of 3rd Battalion, 340 soldiers from an original strength of 1,000, received the briefing in a drainage culvert that served as his command post. His face did not change. He had lost 660 soldiers in 3 days, and whatever part of him processed grief had been buried under something harder and more functional. He asked for the bombardment timing, noted it on his wrist display, and said, "My soldiers will be ready." Lieutenant Colonel Yusuf Bar, commanding the artillery batteries that had been providing suppressive fire on the Kethara Ridge, did not ask about casualties. He asked about targeting data. "If the barriers thin in sections, I need to know exactly where and for how long. My guns can create a rolling suppression ahead of the infantry push, but only if I know which gaps to fire through." Maddox gave him the engineer's models, the predicted gap locations, based on the thermal dissipation patterns of the Kethara barrier technology. Barr studied them for 11 minutes, made 3 corrections based on his own observations of the barrier's behavior during previous bombardments, and told Maddox his batteries would be ready. Maddox walked the medical stations next. Chief Medical Officer Captain Lena Osai had set up a triage system in a series of connected trenches 200 meters behind the main line, staffed by 31 medics and 4 surgeons operating under tarps strung between support beams salvaged from destroyed Kethara structures. The medical supplies were running low: plasma, synthetic blood, burn dressings, the fast-acting coagulants that kept soldiers alive long enough to reach the surgical stations. Os did not ask about the assault plan. She looked at Maddox's face and said, "How many should we expect?" "Plan for 2,000 in the first hour." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned to her staff and began redistributing supplies. At hour 6, Maddox called his senior officers together in the main command trench. There were 9 of them: 3 battalion commanders, 2 company commanders who had assumed battalion-level responsibilities after their superiors were killed, the artillery commander, the engineering officer, the signals officer, and the logistics officer. They stood in a rough semicircle around a terrain model built from packed soil and fragments of Kethara stone, the ridge line sculpted in miniature, the tower complex marked with embedded shell casings. He told them the plan, he told them the timing, he told them the casualty projections. He did not soften them. "This is a one-pass assault," he said. "We do not have the strength or the supplies for a second attempt. The bombardment opens the gaps. We push through the gaps. We reach the barrier generators inside the temple complex and we destroy them. Once the barriers fall, Admiral Chen's fleet can target the Kethara positions directly, and the ground campaign is over." He paused. "Getting to the generators will cost us most of this force. I am not going to stand here and tell you otherwise. The engineers project 60 to 70% casualties in the approach, and another 20 to 30% in the close fighting inside the complex." Nobody spoke. Maddox watched their faces. Sans was granite. Tannis looked at the terrain model with an expression that might have been acceptance, or might have been something past acceptance, something that existed on the other side of fear, where the body has already processed the worst, and found it survivable only because it has stopped caring about survival. Barr was already calculating firing solutions in his head, his eyes tracking the gap positions on the model. "I know what I'm asking," Maddox said. "I know the cost. I'm asking because the alternative is worse." The Kethara walked through Caldera Station and killed 8 million people with blades because their theology told them human existence was sin. If we fail here, if those barriers stand, the hierarchs will declare a second reclamation. They've done it before. 11,000 years of holy wars, 47 species incorporated into their temple stone. We are not going to be the 48th. He looked at each of them in turn. We are going to cross that field. We are going to push through those gaps. We are going to walk into their most sacred place and break the thing that protects it. And when it falls, every gun in orbit is going to remind the burning orthodoxy that the cost of touching us is more than their God can cover. Major San spoke first. Rules of engagement inside the complex. Standard rules apply. We are not them, but the generators are the objective, and anything between us and the generators is a valid target. This is not a negotiation. This is not a demonstration. This is the answer. What about the towers themselves? Lieutenant Colonel Barr asked. Once the barriers fall, does the fleet level the temple? Maddox considered it. The towers of Kethara were 11,000 years old. They contained scripture the Sethari believed was the voice of their God. They also contained the powdered bones of 47 species ground into their walls. The towers stand until we've secured the generators and evacuated our wounded. After that, Admiral Chen has discretion. He knew what Chen would decide. He had seen the Admiral's face during the briefing when the forensic analysis of the tower stone was presented. Chen was not a man who left monuments to genocide standing. At hour 10, Maddox walked the line one final time. The soldiers were preparing, not the frantic preparation of panic, but the quiet, methodical preparation of professionals who have been told the odds and chosen to go anyway. Rifles were cleaned and checked. Ammunition was distributed to the round. Body armor was inspected, adjusted, sealed. Soldiers wrote short messages on scraps of paper and tucked them into sealed pouches, letters that would be found if they were not. Maddox stopped at a forward position where a fire team of 4 soldiers sat against the trench wall, their helmets off, eating the last of their ration packs. The youngest was a private named Ilara Vaughn, 19 years old, from a settlement on Ganymede. She had been in the army for 14 months. She had been on Kethara V for 3 days. She had already killed 4 Sethari soldiers in a close engagement during the second day's skirmish along the drainage channels, and the medics had treated a laceration on her forearm, where a Sethari blade had cut through her sleeve during the same fight. "Commander," she said, not standing, not saluting. There was no time for ceremony in a trench. "Vaughn, is it true the towers are made of bones?" "Yes." She looked at the ridge, where the towers caught the last of the day's light. "Then we're bringing them down." It was not a question. Maddox moved on. At hour 12, the Sethari bombardment intensified. They knew something was coming. The mortar fire shifted from suppressive harassment to concentrated barrages targeting the human command positions, the medical stations, the ammunition stores. Maddox lost 2 ammunition caches and a forward medical post in 20 minutes. 14 more soldiers dead. The Sethari were probing with infantry patrols along the ridgeline, testing the human positions, looking for weakness. Barr's artillery drove them back each time, but the ammunition expenditure was eating into the reserves allocated for the assault. "We're going to be short on suppressive rounds for the approach," Barr reported at hour 13. "How short?" 12 minutes instead of 15. After that, the guns go dry until the fleet bombardment opens. 12 minutes of artillery suppression to cover 7,000 soldiers crossing 400 meters of open ground. Maddox adjusted the plan. The first wave would advance in a staggered formation, using the rolling artillery barrage as cover for the initial 200 meters. When the artillery stopped, the soldiers would have to cover the remaining distance under direct Sethari fire for the 3 minutes between the artillery ceasing and the fleet bombardment beginning. 3 minutes in the open, against magnetic lance batteries and 40,000 Sethari warriors. Maddox calculated the cost of those 3 minutes and added it to the number he was already carrying. At hour 14, 5:30, Maddox gathered the assault force. 7,600 soldiers formed up in the trench system, organized into 3 waves. First wave, 2,000 soldiers tasked with reaching the barrier gaps and establishing a foothold. Second wave, 3,000 following 60 seconds behind the first, tasked with pushing through the gaps and advancing to the temple complex. Third wave, 2,600, carrying the demolition charges for the barrier generators, the heaviest weapons, and the combat engineers who would place and detonate the charges. Maddox stood on a firing step at the center of the line, where the main assault corridor faced the ridge. He could see the towers of Kethara in the pre-dawn light, their white stone glowing faintly against the dark sky, the prismatic veins catching starlight. In 30 minutes, every ship in Chen's fleet would open fire on that ridge. The barriers would absorb it. The stone would shake. And then, for 90 seconds, the shield would thin, and the gap would open, and 7,600 human beings would run toward it. He keyed the command frequency. Every soldier in the assault force heard his voice. "You know why we're here. 3 years ago, the Kethara walked through Caldera Station and killed 8 million of our people. Not with bombs, not with guns, with blades. One at a time. 14 hours. They cut through families eating dinner. They cut through children in schoolrooms. They cut through medical staff treating the wounded from the floors they had already cleared. And when they were finished, they ground the bones to powder and mixed them into the stone of their temple, and they called it worship." He paused. The trench was silent. 7,600 faces turned toward him in the gray light. "We are not here for revenge. Revenge is what you do when someone wrongs you and you want them to hurt. We are here because if we do not break those barriers today, the hierarchs will issue a second decree, and they will walk through another station, and they will cut again, because their scripture tells them we are sin, and sin must be reclaimed. We are here to make the reclamation so expensive that no hierarch in the next 11,000 years will ever sign another decree." He looked at the ridge. The towers caught the first edge of dawn, and the bone-white stone blushed gold. "In 30 minutes the fleet opens fire. You will feel the ground shake. You will see the barriers flare. When the bombardment stops, there will be gaps. 90 seconds. That is our window. We go through the gaps, we cross the complex, we reach the generators, and we break them. Once the barriers fall, the fleet handles the rest." He did not tell them the casualty projections. They knew. Every soldier in the line had done the mathematics the way soldiers always did, not with numbers, but with a glance at the terrain, a memory of the last 3 days, and the quiet understanding that the person standing next to them might not be standing in an hour. "I will be in the first wave, center corridor. I will be the first one through the gap, or the first one who doesn't make it. Either way, you will know that your commander asked you to do nothing he would not do himself." He took a breath. "They will remember what we were, not what we said, not what we planned, what we did on this field today." He lowered the handset. Silence held for 3 seconds. Then Major San, standing 20 meters to his right, slammed the stock of her rifle against the trench wall twice. The sound was sharp and final, like a door closing. The soldiers nearest her repeated it. The sound traveled down the line, 2.5 kilometers of rifle stock striking packed earth, a rolling percussion that built into a wall of sound that had no words and needed none. 600. The sky split. Admiral Chen's fleet opened fire from orbit with a sustained barrage that turned the atmosphere above the ridge into a corridor of white light. Plasma lances, kinetic accelerators, fusion-tip penetrators, 9,000 warships pouring their combined firepower into a frontage 800 meters wide. The ground shook so hard Maddox's teeth rattled. The air itself seemed to compress, then expand, then compress again in waves that made breathing difficult. The noise was not noise. It was a physical presence, a pressure that squeezed the chest and vibrated in the bones. The Kethara barriers flared. Maddox watched through the observation notch as the energy shields lit up across the ridge, absorbing the bombardment, converting kinetic energy into thermal energy, radiating heat in waves that made the air shimmer like a mirage. The white stone of the towers glowed. The barrier generators beneath the complex screamed a high-pitched harmonic that cut through the bombardment noise and told Maddox the engineers were right. The thermal dissipation system was overloading. The barriers were holding, but the heat had to go somewhere, and the generators were running at the edge of their capacity. 15 minutes of sustained fleet bombardment. Maddox counted the seconds. At minute 12, Barr's artillery opened up with the remaining suppressive rounds, targeting the Kethara gun emplacements on the ridge line visible through the barrier shimmer. At minute 14, Maddox pulled himself onto the firing step and faced the assault force. First wave stand. 2,000 soldiers rose from the trench. The bombardment stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Maddox had ever heard. The barriers were still up, but they were wavering, flickering across the ridge in visible patterns, sections dimming and brightening as the overloaded generators struggled to redistribute the thermal load. The engineers had predicted 90 seconds of vulnerability. Maddox could see the gaps, 3 sections of the barrier, each roughly 40 meters wide, where the energy field had thinned to a translucent shimmer instead of the solid curtain it had been. "Go," Maddox said and went. He cleared the trench parapet and ran. Around him, 2,000 soldiers poured over the top and into the killing field, spread across the 800-meter frontage, converging on the 3 gaps. The ground under his boots was churned and cratered, the alien soil loose and unstable, every step a negotiation with terrain that had been hammered by 3 days of bombardment and 15 minutes of fleet-scale fire. Behind him, Barr's artillery fired its last rounds, creating a curtain of explosions along the ridge to suppress the Kethara positions. The Kethara opened fire at the 40-second mark. Magnetic lances cut through the advancing line in horizontal sheets of ionized metal, each lance bolt capable of penetrating body armor at 600 meters. Maddox heard the impacts before he saw them, a sound like wet fabric tearing, followed by the clatter of ceramic plate fragments hitting the ground. Soldiers fell. He did not look. Looking cost seconds, and seconds cost lives. He ran. The gap was 200 meters ahead. Around him, the first wave thinned. A lance bolt passed close enough to his left shoulder that he felt the heat through his armor. Another hit the soldier 3 meters to his right, Private Casa, a quiet man from the northern settlements who collected pressed flowers from every planet he deployed to, and Casa went down without a sound, his legs gone below the knee, his body rolling once in the loose soil before lying still. At 150 meters, Maddox's formation had lost a third of its strength. 600 soldiers down in 90 seconds of crossing. The Kethara lances were cycling faster now, their gunners adjusting to the advancing line, concentrating fire on the 3 gap corridors where the infantry was funneling. Maddox could see the barrier gaps directly ahead, 40 meters of thinned energy, the air inside them rippling with residual heat from the overloaded generators, the white stone of the ridge visible through the shimmer. At 100 meters, the second wave hit the field. 3,000 soldiers, following 60 seconds behind, spreading across the same cratered ground, absorbing the same fire. The Kethara lances shifted, splitting between the 2 waves, and for a few seconds the pressure on the first wave eased, not much, but enough for Maddox to close the last 100 meters at a dead sprint. He hit the gap at a full run. The barrier energy was hot, not burning, but a dry, oppressive heat that pressed against exposed skin and made his eyes water. He pushed through it in 3 strides, felt it resist like walking through warm gelatin, and then he was through, on the other side, standing on the inner slope of the ridge with the towers of Kethara rising above him. The Kethara were waiting. Not with lances, the inner slope was too close for magnetic artillery. With blades. The penitent warriors emerged from prepared fighting positions carved into the white stone, their ceremonial blades extended, their voices raised in the liturgical war chant that the burning orthodoxy had used for 11,000 years. They were tall 2.5 meters on average, with the broad, angular frames of a species evolved on a high-gravity world, and they moved with a coordinated precision that spoke of lifetimes of training. Maddox fired from the hip as the first penitent reached him, 2 rounds center mass at point-blank range. The Kethara staggered, but did not fall. Their ceremonial armor was layered bone composite over a ceramic mesh that could absorb small arms fire at close range. The third round found the gap between the chest plate and the shoulder guard, and the penitent dropped. Around him, soldiers from the first wave were engaging in close quarters. The gap corridors became choke points where human soldiers pushed through and immediately met Kethara blades in a compressed, chaotic melee that had no front line and no flanks. Maddox saw Major San 20 meters to his left, firing controlled bursts into a cluster of penitents, while soldiers from her battalion pushed past her into the complex. He saw Captain Tanny's go down a blade across the back of his leg, severing the armor seal, the blood immediate and dark, and then saw Tanny's pull himself upright against the stone wall and keep firing with his rifle braced on the rock. The third wave hit the gaps 7 minutes after the first, 2,600 soldiers carrying the demolition charges, pushing through the barrier gaps that were already closing, the generators recovering, the thermal overload dissipating, the barrier strengthening. The engineers had said 90 seconds. It had been 8 minutes and the gaps were narrowing. The last soldiers of the third wave dove through barrier sections that had already recovered to 70% strength. The energy field burning exposed skin, overloading electronics, killing 2 soldiers outright whose armor systems failed from the electromagnetic pulse. But they were through. The charges were through. Maddox fought his way forward through the temple complex. The architecture was alien and massive corridors 10 meters wide, ceilings 15 meters high, walls of bone-white stone carved with scripture that glowed faintly with embedded bioluminescence. The Kethara defended every corridor, every junction, every stairwell leading downward to the barrier generators. Maddox's force moved in leapfrog teams, clearing rooms with grenades and overlapping fire, pushing through penitent counterattacks that came in waves of 20 or 30 warriors at a time. The cost was constant. Every corridor they cleared cost soldiers, every junction they held cost soldiers, every minute they spent inside the complex cost soldiers. Maddox stopped counting the dead at the second interior junction when the number passed a threshold that his mind could no longer process while simultaneously making tactical decisions. He gave orders. He moved forward. He fired. He reloaded. He moved forward. At the fourth junction, a Kethara blade caught him across the left arm, cutting through the armor seal and into the muscle beneath. The pain was sharp and clean and distant, as if it belonged to someone else's body. Lieutenant Davy appeared beside him, applied a pressure seal from her kit, and shoved a stimulant injector into his neck without asking permission. The world sharpened. The pain retreated to a dull background noise. Maddox moved forward. They reached the first generator at 6:47. It was in a chamber beneath the central tower, a vast underground space, 60 meters across, the ceiling supported by pillars of the same bone-white stone, the generator itself, a cylinder of dark metal 12 meters tall, humming with a frequency that made Maddox's damaged arm ache. The engineering team, 11 soldiers from the original 24 who had entered the complex carrying charges, set the demolition package, while Maddox's remaining infantry held the chamber entrances against continuous Kethara counterattacks. Charges set, the lead engineer, Sergeant Voss, reported. 60-second timer. Set them all, every generator, simultaneous detonation. Voss looked at him. Commander, we have charges for 3 generators. There are 7. Then we set 3, and the fleet handles the rest once the barrier weakens. They moved to the second generator, fighting through 2 more corridors. Maddox's force was down to fewer than 800 effective soldiers from the original 7,600. The rest were dead, wounded, or cut off in other sections of the complex, fighting their own close-quarters battles against Kethara penitents who would not stop coming because stopping was apostasy. The second generator was smaller, set in a secondary chamber connected to the first by a maintenance tunnel. Voss set the charges in 4 minutes. The third generator was 200 meters further down, deeper beneath the complex, in a chamber that the Kethara defended with particular ferocity. This was the oldest generator, the one the hierarchs had consecrated personally, the one they called the heart of the orthodoxy. Maddox lost 60 soldiers taking the heart chamber, 60 soldiers in 8 minutes. He would carry those 8 minutes for the rest of his life, however long or short that turned out to be. The penitents in the heart chamber were not regular soldiers. They were the consecrated, the elite guard of the hierarchs themselves, warriors who had undergone a ritual process that the intelligence analysts believed involved the surgical removal of the fear response. They fought without hesitation, without retreat, without the micropauses of self-preservation that even the bravest soldiers exhibited. They fought like machines made of flesh, and they died like machines, falling where they stood without a sound. Voss set the final charges with hands that were perfectly steady. Maddox watched her work. She was 29 years old, had a daughter on Mars she had not seen in 11 months, and was placing enough explosives to destroy a generator that had run continuously for 6,000 years. Her hands did not shake. Her breathing was even. She finished, stood, looked at Maddox and said, "Ready. All units, this is Maddox. Clear the generator chambers. Detonation in 90 seconds." The withdrawal was controlled chaos. Soldiers pulled back from the 3 generator chambers, carrying their wounded, fighting rearguard actions against Kethara penitents who surged into every corridor the humans vacated. Maddox was the last one out of the heart chamber, firing backward through the doorway as 4 consecrated warriors charged in formation. He hit 3. The 4th reached the doorway and died there, its blade embedding in the stone frame 3 centimeters from Maddox's head. He ran. Behind him, the 90-second timer counted down. The detonation was felt before it was heard. A deep, subsonic pulse that traveled through the stone and the earth and the bodies of every soldier in the complex, a vibration that felt like the planet itself clenching. Then the sound, a triple concussion, 3 generators dying simultaneously, their energy reserves dumping into the surrounding stone in a cascade that turned the walls of the heart chamber into plasma for a fraction of a second. The barriers fell. Maddox felt it in his bones. The constant low-frequency hum that had pervaded the complex since they entered the background noise of 7 barrier generators, maintaining a continuous energy shield around the temple, stopped. The silence that replaced it was absolute and final. Above them, Admiral Chen's fleet had been waiting. The moment the barriers dropped, 9,000 warships opened fire. Not on the temple complex. Maddox's soldiers were still inside, on every Kethara military position outside the barrier perimeter, the gun emplacements on the ridge, the staging areas behind the towers, the ammunition stores, the communication arrays, the landing pads where Kethara reinforcement shuttles had been gathering for a counterattack. Every target the fleet had been mapping for 3 days and been unable to hit through the barriers. The bombardment lasted 9 minutes. When it stopped, the Kethara military presence on Kethara V had been reduced to scattered infantry units cut off from command, communication, and resupply. The 40,000 penitent warriors who had defended the ridge were gone, not defeated, not routed, gone. The fleet's precision targeting had distinguished between military installations and the temple structures themselves with the kind of accuracy that only became possible when the barrier generators were no longer distorting the targeting systems. Maddox stood in a corridor of the temple complex, his left arm bleeding through the pressure seal, his rifle empty, His remaining soldiers, fewer than 500, gathered around him in the bone-white hallway. The towers of Kethara still stood above them. The scripture carved into the walls still glowed faintly. The bone powder in the stone still held the remains of 47 species. His communication unit crackled. "Maddox, this is Chen. Barriers are confirmed down. Sethari military assets on Kethara V are neutralized. The ground is yours." A pause. "Casualties." Maddox closed his eyes. The number was in his head, compiled automatically from the unit reports that had been streaming through his tactical display throughout the assault. He had been aware of each report as it came in, each name, each designation, each status change from active to wounded to killed. He had processed them and set them aside and kept moving because that was what the mission required. Now the mission was complete and the numbers were still there, waiting. 7,100 casualties, he said. Approximately 4,800 killed, 2,300 wounded. Out of 7,600. He had led 7,600 soldiers across that field, and 500 were still standing. The channel was quiet for a long time. Then Chen said, "The Sethari battle groups are still inbound. 16 hours. I'm pulling the fleet to defensive positions. Can you hold the complex? We're not leaving until the towers come down." The towers. The stone contains the remains of every species they've reclaimed. 47 species in the walls, Admiral, including ours from Caldera. I want demolition teams and heavy equipment. We're going to take the towers apart, recover what can be identified, and then level what's left. The hierarchs are going to watch their most sacred site become a memorial for the people they ground into building material. Chen was quiet again. "You have your demolition teams. I'll hold the orbital perimeter." Maddox lowered the handset. Around him, the 500 survivors stood in the corridor of white stone, their armor scorched and dented and stained, their faces carrying the particular expression of soldiers who have walked through something that will define the rest of their lives. None of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the silence did not already contain. Maddox put his hand against the wall. The stone was warm. The prismatic veins caught the light from the bioluminescent scripture, scattering blues and golds through the bone-white surface. Somewhere in this stone were the remains of species who had lived and built and created and been reclaimed by the burning orthodoxy, because their existence was declared sin. Somewhere in this stone were fragments of 8 million human beings from Caldera Station. He pulled his hand away and looked at the blood his wounded arm had left on the white surface. It was bright red against the bone-white stone, and it did not soak in. The stone refused it. After 11,000 years of absorbing the dead, the walls of Kethara had rejected the blood of the living. Maddox turned to his soldiers. "Secure the perimeter. Establish a defensive line at the main entrance. Medical teams begin triage on the complex floor." He paused. "And find the Hierarch's trophy chamber. I want a full forensic record before the demolition teams arrive." Private Vaughn, the 19-year-old from Ganymede who had asked about the bones, stood near the wall with her rifle at rest. There was a cut across her cheek that had already been sealed with a field dressing. She looked at the wall, at the prismatic veins, at the blood Maddox had left there. "Commander," she said, "they're going to feel this for 11,000 years." Maddox did not answer. He did not need to. The towers of Kethara still stood, but they would not stand for long. The fleet held orbit. The demolition teams were inbound. And in the white stone walls, the bones of 47 species waited to be named, counted, and carried home. The hierarchs had built their temples from the dead and called it sacred. Earth had walked through the front door and called it the bill. No one was going to mistake the payment for mercy.